Hey everybody, it's Abishur Prakash, aka Mr. Geopolitics. The US and China are back to where they were just a couple of months ago. This is, in many ways, a geopolitical time warp as US President Donald Trump threatens to raise the tariffs on the Chinese government and economy as China expands its control over rare earth metals, as China probes American tech companies, as China takes action against American chip companies like Nvidia. This is a reversal of months of negotiations, which have led to the US and China doing a complete reversal, a complete time warp, a complete 180 to where they were just earlier this year. Now, I've discussed this at length, and I've shared multiple times that the United States and China will not be able to cut a holistic deal. They may be able to cut a trade deal, but they will struggle to ink a deal that covers everything. And the signs of this challenge, of these limitations, were there for months now. There was the US government, specifically Besant, saying that US China negotiating teams would meet in months, meaning it would be months of space, months before both sides agreed to new talks. Now, if there are negotiations in business or government, they don't take place with multiple months of gap between them. Usually they increase in frequency, in time, in activity. That was the biggest sign that these talks were not going as the US, China, and the global economy wanted. Adding to that, the Chinese telling their local companies to stop buying NVIDIA chips, the Chinese government unveiling new rules around technology procurement. All of these were signs that China was not bending, was not capitulating the way it once did to America's will. So there were many clues, many signs of where the US and China were heading and where they have found themselves today. Now, this is a very significant moment for the US and China. If America and China cannot put aside their differences, cannot find the middle ground to create a new deal, then it will result in more fighting, in more chaos, in more uncertainty. If the US and China return to where they were in April, which more and more signs point to, then this will be one of the last remaining instances of the United States and China attempting dialogue, attempting a major breakthrough, considering this is a decades-long competition. Over this decades-long competition, this period of time will be remembered as one of the few cases where both sides tried to put aside their differences and ink a deal, and yet they couldn't. So the world now has experience with the US and China working together in the 80s, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, driving globalization. The world now has experience with the US and China colliding on a scale that hasn't been seen. As I said, when US President Trump unveiled his Liberation Day tariffs, this was not a tariff war or trade war with China. This was an economic war, the likes of which the world has never seen. And now the world is on the precipice of seeing the US and China fighting again. Now, before I get into what this means, where this could lead to, I want to discuss what happened. Why did the US and China end up where they are today? How come they couldn't put aside their issues, solve their issues, reduce their headaches, and if not embrace fully and not lock hands fully, then at least align on issues that would provide mutual gain? Well, there are several key reasons why the United States and China could not ink a deal, why they are returning to the same climate they were in just a few months ago, why the broader rapprochement has largely failed. Number one is that there are just too many differences between the US and China to overcome. The chasms between both sides have reached an irreversible point where they can't be bridged, where they can't be solved, where they can't be reduced and brought together again. These are two countries that, in many ways, have been in a direction of distance and separation for 15 years now. And few were paying attention to the divergence on technology, on climate, on economics, on globalization, on global rules, on being a responsible stakeholder, particularly in regards to China. Now that the world is aware of where the US and China are at, they're realizing how far apart the world's two largest economies have drifted. So the ability for these nations to overcome that space, to sign a deal that changes the status quo, is very limited. This was never possible holistically, from tariffs to Taiwan to technology, but even in more narrow settings, particularly trade, this was a giant Herculean endeavor. Second is that there was no end to the US China fight. Both sides paused their direct collision, but they didn't stop competing with each other across the world. There's the various tie-ups that China has been pursuing, i.e., in Europe. There's the moves that America has made, like the trade deal with Vietnam that imposes a 40% trans-shipping tax on Chinese goods, which means that any Chinese goods that pass through Vietnam as a way to escape US tariffs and sanctions on the Chinese economy, also referred to as re-exporting, will now face a 40% tariff. So the US and China, as much as they paused and brought down their tariff walls from April, they did not stop swinging at each other in other domains. And this has constantly raised the heat, like Kenya, for example, converting its dollar-based debt issued by China into Chinese yuan, or the deals that America has struck in the Middle East or in parts of Europe, like in Norway with Stargate, the Stargate project from OpenAI in Norway, which effectively redefines America's reach and power and blocks out China in the AI space. These are not small, shallow deals. This isn't about America exporting certain agricultural products and edging out China. These are deals that will define the present and future of geopolitics. These are deals that force either economy to change step, to change position, to change design. So once again, the US and China might have paused their direct collision, but they didn't pause how they were fighting with each other across the world. Lastly, is that both the United States and China are employing a new strategy to deal with one another. America first on the world stage translates into American unpredictability and American unfamiliarity. Meanwhile, China is echoing and reflecting and moving with a new boldness, a new aggressiveness, a new sense of its economic weight and position in the world. The Chinese aren't simply bowing to America, keeping their mouth shut, biting their tongue. They're willing to meet America in the battlefield. When America raised tariffs in April, China raised tariffs. When America brought down tariffs, China weaponized rare earth exports. And now, just weeks before a potential Xi-Trump meet, which at this point looks increasingly unlikely, now before that, China is moving on multiple fronts at once, firing multiple cylinders at the same time, surrounding America from tech to trade, directly and indirectly, almost as a warning of what's to come if America doesn't sign a deal. This is a massive shift from the past, when it was America that held the cards, when it was America that decided when a deal would be signed, when it was America that decided how much pressure to exert or release. Now China is the one sending the messages. China is the one signaling that it's at the end of its runway, its patience, its discussions vis-a-vis a trade deal. vis-a-vis the US. And if a deal is not cut now, this is what will begin a multi-pronged, a multi-front fight that spins the US and China differently, and in the process disrupts the global economy. Now, this last part is particularly important because China has been very cautious and very calculated in the steps it's taken, not just to anger America, but to protect its footprint and its access to the global economy. Now, however, China is willing and ready and is locking horns with the US in ways that could sideline, that could restrict the Chinese access to the global economy, the Chinese flow of goods to the world, the Chinese ability to attract foreign investment, to attract new capital. All of this is on the line now. As China collides with America, the Chinese know this, and yet they're still doing it. So that's why the US and China have ended up where they are. Both sides have not been able to see eye to eye. The situation is far more complicated than headlines make it seem. This is about serious structural differences between the US and China. I went into some of these in my video earlier this year that a US-China economic war has begun. Check that out if you haven't seen it. But this is the state of play and has been the state of play, not just since Donald Trump re-entered the White House in January, but it's been in this way for decades now. And now the consequences, the result, are starting to materialize, are starting to form. Now, as I said before, there is a short window of opportunity. The APEC summit in Korea at the end of this month, where US President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping were planning to meet, remains on the table. This meeting still has life, but it all depends on what happens in the next 2 weeks. If the US and China can't find a way to heal, can't find a way to keep their other issues on the periphery and focus on what they can achieve, including the TikTok deal, which is likely to fall apart if the US and China return to swinging. If none of that happens, then the world is on the precipice of the two largest economies getting bloody. And the two largest economies won't swing at each other with the gloves on, but will take the gloves off. And this means several things at once for today and tomorrow. Number one, it means that the global economy is about to return to a point which is even greater in terms of uncertainty, in terms of volatility, in terms of unpredictability than in April 2025. April 2025, many global investors, many governments, many businesses were in a state of panic and crisis as the US and China raised the tariffs higher and higher and opened the door to some kind of massive economic fight. This part of it was alleviated, was paused, was resolved, at least temporarily, but now the US and China risk falling back into that same situation, but in an even greater degree. And unlike before, where there was hope that the US and China could resolve their differences through talks, now that hope is diminished, if not fully gone. Now the US and China will be swinging at each other, knowing that talks have failed. This is a very different standpoint to fight from when negotiations have stalled, when talks have not created any real results. This is what's on the table now. If the US and China can't put aside their differences, the global economy will enter a storm, a period of grayness, as the entire world struggles to figure out what to do, who to turn to, and what to do next. Second is that because talks have failed, the United States and China could show zero restraint in what they do to each other next. The conditions are forming for both sides to take the most disruptive decisions and choices toward one another and towards each other's allies that completely change how the globe functions. Because the gloves are off, because talks have failed, and because hope is diminishing for some kind of breakthrough, the US and China may see little need to show restraint, to exercise control, and could get bloody with each other very fast. And driving all of this are changes like US President Trump not getting the Nobel Peace Prize, China's economy having a huge rally this year, largely because of domestic investors and domestic sentiment, China rerouting its reliance on the US. For example, soybeans, where 95% of China's soybean needs are now being supplied by Brazil. And on the other side, where other countries, from Brazil exporting coffee to Peru exporting blueberries to African nations, have all redirected their trade to China to deal with America's tariffs. So China is in a very different position today than it was in April when the fight began. The Chinese have taken steps rapidly to reduce their exposure to the US. Meanwhile, America has not. And this may mean that America is in a weaker position than China in this new round of fighting, in this new economic fight between the world's two largest economies. And once again, the catalyst for this behavior is an acknowledgement from both sides that talks have not failed and new talks will not work. Third is that the entire business community is facing a monumental challenge to their present and future, from supply chains, technology, to workforce, to expansion. Every aspect of business operations is now at the mercy of what the US and China do next. And while many businesses may have planned for some kind of trade deal to surface with the hope that profits would trump politics, now it's politics trumping profits. And that means that business planning for the worst, if that even exists, will now become central, not temporarily, but permanently. So this is a strategic shift for global businesses where they need to now navigate the choppy geopolitical waters indefinitely. Most companies are used to dealing with crises in a temporary way, but now geopolitical instability is the new status quo, driven entirely and largely by the US and China. And most global businesses will be forced to do things that they haven't thought of doing or haven't wanted to do ever before. Anthropic, for example, telling companies that are more than 50% owned by China that they can't access their Anthropic's AI services is an example of how extreme and how radical corporate executives may have to go as the US-China fight pressures and surrounds them. Lastly is that this US-China fight that's restarting, reigniting, flaring up again, will not just be limited to the US and China directly. There is now complete grayness on issues from Taiwan, from issues like China's involvement with Russia in Ukraine, from issues like China buying Iranian oil, not through dollars, but through barter trade, mainly Chinese infrastructure projects in Iran. All of these fronts have been pushed to the side as the US and China have negotiated a deal. Now that a deal is out of reach, it seems, these fronts could be converted into fights. And these could be areas where the US and China are clashing, are colliding, and are attempting to check each other in the most radical ways. So there is a new uncertainty, not just about the US and China directly, but about every other region in the world, especially powder kegs, and powder kegs that have exploded and could explode, and what happens next if Washington and Beijing are getting bloody. The reality is that the US and China were never going to be friends the way many hoped. This is a relationship that from the beginning was besieged by uncertainty, by challenges, by real differences, ideological, economical, historical, that meant their future would be very much one of love and hate. The hope, however, has been that the US and China could find a way to dance together, could find a way to maintain stability in their relationship and therefore the world's global economy, the world's alliances, the world's architecture and design, that all of this could remain intact if the US and China could get along. Now, this is all unlikely. Now, the probability of a US China fight is exceeding the probability of a US China trade deal, and this requires every global stakeholder, from country to company to citizen, to rethink what tomorrow looks like. Now, if you're wondering exactly what could take place next between the United States and China, what either side might do to each other in the coming quarters and years, exactly what disruptions could emerge that sideline markets, economies, businesses, alliances, nations, then check out my latest report on the future of the US-China fight. The link is in comments. Tell me in the comments below, what do you think about the US-China fight? Is this a fight that will return to talks, or is it now past the point of no return? Is this going to be real collision, real blood, real chaos? If you resonated with this video, don't forget to hit subscribe and like. Until next time, this is Mr. Geopolitics signing off.